Well, I think even, again, Heidegger said that thinking is piety. It's a form of...
Piety. I don't even know what that word is. What is piety?
Piety is the way that which a religious person who is pious...
Oh yeah,
that's how they comport, or they direct themselves towards the God.
So they're like, is that like
praying or practicing, going to mass or whatever they do. So the way they organize their life in a way that is respectful or circumspect when they're in proximity to the divine.
Okay, say that sentence again now.
So thinking is piety.
Thinking is piety.
That kind of awareness about life and being and one's place in nature, etc. That is good religion, you might want to call it.
Yeah.
That's spirituality. You could say that. Philosophy of spirituality perhaps is another way of putting it. I'm just making this up now.
Right, no, sure.
The spot. But yeah, to the proper way to orient oneself towards the real is thinking carefully about it.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today's episode, we're gonna step outside of our normal patterns of thinking. To say the least, to step into a philosophical mindset is a little bit challenging. It's weird. You gotta bring out your inner stoner, ask why all the time. Like, you know how children always ask why? And when they ask why long enough, it gets to the point where you're like, I don't know, because of the fundamental laws of nature that exist that we don't completely and totally understand. Those are the type of questions we're going to be talking about today. So every once in a while, I like to mix it up with a person that can help us step outside of our normal thinking patterns and help us try to make sense of why we do things. We're talking about environmental sustainability. We're talking about, land management and that kind of things. It's good to ground yourself in, okay, ultimately, why am I doing this? Right? And what are the justifications for doing it? So I brought on Dr. Nathan Kowalsky. He is an associate professor of philosophy and environmental philosophy and ethics, philosophy of religion, culture, and of technology. And what brought me to him was his book about the philosophy of hunting. And that's not what we're talking about today, but that is what got me attracted to him. And I started to read some of his papers and realized that he'd be the perfect person to have on the show to talk about the philosophy of our relationship to nature. And it was I just felt like I was sitting across. We just met during this episode, but I felt like I was sitting across from a longtime friend, and we were just sitting there pontificating and going back and forth on weird ideas as if I was, we're still in post-secondary and just like having a beer, thinking about weird stuff, right? It felt great. And so this conversation, we're talking about morality and can we apply our morality to ecosystems? Do we have an obligation to steward the land, to be a part of the ecosystem that is this earth? And how do we go about doing that? And if this is your first foray into philosophical thinking, open your mind. Try to let go of those preconceived notions of what you expect and how you expect the world to work. Try to be open to suggestion and to thinking fluidly. Don't stay stuck in your box. It's good to step out of it. That's what we're going to be doing today. And I couldn't be more happy to give you guys this conversation. So sponsors for this episode. West Fraser is the number one sponsor for 2023. Without them, this would not be possible. Thank you, West Fraser, for all of your support. I couldn't do it without you. And also, Greenlink Forestry has been with me since the beginning, and I couldn't do it without them. Thank you, Greenlink. So, without any further messing around, let's dive into this super mind-bending conversation about morality, respect, obligation, and where we fit in this thing we call nature. Here we go. So, actually, I have a kind of a funny, just like a weird thing I want to start on, because I've noticed this, and I asked someone before, and they didn't have an answer for me. I want to know, as a person that writes a lot about the environment, what is the significance of, I notice a lot of environmental writers do not say outdoors. They say out of doors.
Oh.
And I've noticed that that's a very, I don't know, it's only in environmental writing. Anytime you have like just a journalist who likes to write about the environment, it's outdoors.
Yeah.
But if it's someone who's dedicated their life to environmental writing, it's normally out of doors.
Yeah. I didn't notice that, but it is a thing for sure. I mean, you pointed out and it's clear. I have a feeling that it might be related to the notion of sportsman as another concept that is problematic somewhat. The outdoors is masculine men going out there shooting, chopping, exploring, driving, mud dogging, whatever it is. And then the out of doors is hopefully, I assume that they're trying to just distance themselves from that.
I see. That makes sense.
That's that notion. But it's still a helpful notion because it's the door is this interesting spot where you switch places.
Yeah.
And they do want to talk about the outdoors, but when they don't want to talk about it probably in a way that makes people think of fishing and hunting and
I like how you dropped the G on hunting there.
Yeah, all that stuff, right? So it's probably that, although I don't know because I've never consciously done it. I think also it just sounds fun.
It does. I that's what I've noticed as well. I think I like it because it's more specific. It paints a better picture of like out of doors. I don't know why.
Yeah. Well, it clarifies what's implicit in the outdoors word, which we don't think of normally because we use it as a package.
Yeah.
Then just those syllables just mean that thing. But when we remember, there's the door involved and we're going out of it.
Yeah.
So I maybe also explicitly laying that out, does something for
I think you're right.
people's awareness.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you that because I noticed in your writing you used a lot of out of doors. So
yeah. Well, because I think I wrote a paper called Going Outside.
Yes.
And I might have changed the title from something like The Out of Doors or something. But it was fun to think about going outside and then working on expanding that,
right.
I think. Anyway, that's probably why.
That
but I don't
sense.
know if because personally I don't mind the I think outdoors manship, which is I don't want to use the word man anymore.
Sure.
I don't know how to undo that, but I think there is a whole underappreciated aspect of activity that human beings do that can be captured by that concept, and that I think maybe some environmental writers don't think about that or as much as they could. Anyway.
Yeah.
No,
that totally makes sense. Yeah, it does seem more specific and like it kind of captures your attention more. And I do like that. Yeah, that's good.
When a piece of language is slightly off the normal bit, then you kind of are aware of it more and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? And then I think that questioning is already part of the reason they use it, I would assume anyway.
There we go. We're already into the philosophy of things.
Yeah.
Perfect. So, just a funny thing I wanted to mention. So then I want to get into your how you got into philosophy, especially the philosophy of nature, wilderness, and our relationship to it. Just I kind of want a quick bio of how you got into this, because I think that paints a good picture of your perspective and where you're coming from. Yeah,
sure. I got into philosophy by accident. My best friend's dad was a philosopher.
Oh, okay,
and he was teaching at Medicine Hat College. And I did my second year of my undergrad there, and I thought I'd take classes with my best friend's dad. And I loved philosophy. So that's basically where it started. I had originally planned on being an engineer because I thought I could get a job as an engineer.
Don't we all?
Yeah, right. Yeah, job was a thing. But then I realized that I didn't like physics as much as I liked philosophy. So that's where I decided to go into philosophy. But I didn't know that environmental philosophy existed in my undergraduate, although I accidentally encountered it and then realized that I did later.
Okay.
One of the founders of environmental aesthetics, which is a branch of philosophy that looks at beauty.
Okay.
He was trying to explain. That founder guy was at the U of A.
Okay.
he taught a class or a section of class on it. So I had a bit of exposure then, but when I was in grad school, my supervisor was an environmentalist and not a philosopher in the sense that he was teaching it then, but he got arrested for chaining himself to trees and stuff.
Right. He was an activist.
Yeah, he lived on Galiano Island, somewhat off the grid. And he exposed me to a paper or a book, actually, I think, by Holmes Rolston III, who is an environmental ethicist. And I realized that you could do philosophy of hunting inside this. And I had been a hunter as a kid and then picked that up again later when I was in undergrad. And I thought it'd be fun to think about hunting. I just didn't know you could.
Yeah.
And then I found out that one of the places you could do that was within the framework of environmental philosophy. So that's actually how I got interested in it, because I was already a hunter and then found out that it was an area of investigation in philosophy there. So then I went on, and then in my doctorate, my supervisor was a vegan.
Okay.
And so that he and I had good he was a very, accommodating vegan, right?
Yeah.
So we had a great productive research relationship there.
It's funny how I personally see those two from, someone who's actively thinking about why they're hunting and a vegan. I see them having a lot more in common than people realize.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it attitudinally is a big deal. If you're going to be fighting and screaming at each other, then it's not going to be, right. You won't find what you do have in common, but there is a lot more in common. Like some of my diet is more in common with a vegan than with people who aren't, which is odd. But yeah, so there's, and environmentalism and conservation and hunting do have more in common than I think it's commonly recognized. But
totally.
I don't think your listeners will be unaware of that.
No, I don't think
so. But generally, it is less of a thing that people are aware of. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's a cool way to come at it. Cause I don't think anyone really, until I received an email about your book, The Philosophy of Hunting, what's it called? Philosophy of Hunting?
No, that's not what it's called. What is it? Yeah. Hunting Philosophy for Everyone. I didn't give this title to my book. It was a part of a series, and everything in it was something philosophy for everyone.
Right.
So it's regular life. Like one was on marijuana, and one was on porn, and one was on drinking beer, and whatever. So it covers that.
Yeah, I did notice that there was a series of stuff.
Yeah, so I was like, well, gardening was one of the ones, and I had proposed a paper on gardening, and they were like, no, we don't want you to write a paper on gardening. So I wrote a paper. I said, how about a whole book on hunting? And they were like, yeah. So Hunting Philosophy for Everyone is the name of the title of the book.
And I haven't read it yet, but I was reading through like your papers and that kind of thing, and that's where I came up. As like I said before, personally, I would love to dive more into the philosophy of hunting, but I think for this show, we're going to keep it to our relationship to environment, that kind of thing. But personally, sometimes I wish I had a hunting podcast so I could just talk specifically about
that. There are hunting podcasts, right?
There's so many. Yeah, there's so many.
I don't do the podcast.
There's more hunting podcasts than there is any other podcast. I think.
Then maybe that's better that we do this instead.
Yeah, maybe it's better. Yeah. So okay. Now that I kind of want to get into, it's funny. I feel the need to start slowly and really just like define why is philosophy important? Like this concept, because I think it's such a, I don't know if ethereal is the right word.
Sure,
but it's not tangible in a way. A lot of ways, a lot of things are, right. So it's hard to contemplate how this fits into our society. So in your words, why is philosophy important when we're considering, the environment and our relationship to it?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, philosophy is what I tell my students this. I tell them that it's the search for the meaning of things. And it's not the only way people find meaning in things. Yeah. Like poetry is another way of expressing meaning, and religion is another way of expressing meaning. Philosophy is one of those ways. And it's important that we understand why things are meaningful, or if they are, right? Mm-hmm. So, it's not evident to our senses usually what the meanings of things are. We can just see colors and shapes very evidently, but if all we do is see colors and shapes and we don't know what the point of this is, then we have issues, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for us to be able to answer, or at least approach questions of meaning in an intelligent way. And philosophy is, I think, fundamentally the attempt to answer or even pose questions about meaning in a helpful way.
Yeah.
I know that in a lot of other disciplines in the university, discussions will keep going for a while, and eventually they'll reach a point where somebody will say, well, that's a philosophical question, and we don't answer that question anymore, right?
Yeah.
Which is acceptable. I understand that, because a lot of disciplines don't have the tools and the resources to answer questions like those. But I think that we still want answers to those kinds of questions. So hopefully philosophers can provide something of that sort. Now, sometimes philosophers don't, and they get all very, abstract and useless and whatever. And that there's criticisms of philosophy that are legitimate as well. But I think what it can offer is a level of depth and profundity to some of the deep things that we want to know about.
Right.
Even though they're incredibly difficult to answer.
Yeah.
Which I think also reminds me too that philosophy is less of a set of answers than it is an activity.
Okay.
So we're less likely to get, the list of the correct answers that philosophy has given us to any of these questions we might have.
Right.
Than an ongoing process of wrestling with these questions, and hopefully doing that in a good way that's satisfying.
Yeah.
But it's not like I can tell you, well, so now philosophy has done this work, and these are the answers, and now you know, right?
Yeah. Here's our finite conclusions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so and so if what we're looking for is final answers, then we will be likely frustrated with philosophy.
Yeah.
But part of being a philosopher is being frustrated, actually.
Yeah. Well, do you think that's why people maybe poo-poo philosophy a little bit? Because it seems like there is no end in sight?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you were just telling me earlier, though, that things are changing in forestry and
constantly. Yeah.
Right. So we should recognize that all the things that we're thinking we are understanding or knowing are in the process of moving and changing and fluctuating and perhaps not ever ending. But for some reason, philosophy comes across as being the ultimately pointless, useless. and I some of that I do understand, but on the other hand, it makes sense, because the questions that we ask in philosophy are ones that are ancient problems that all human beings probably have wondered about.
Yeah.
And we don't just get answers to those questions that they'll, now you're fine.
Yeah.
Because individuals have to process those questions for themselves.
Yeah.
And so we basically do the same thing over and over again, because we're the same people, I think.
Yeah.
Doing the human project over and over again.
Yeah.
So and sure, there'll be differences in schools of thought and whatnot, and that's fun. So sure. But, I think to be a philosopher is to be frustrated by the difficulty of the problem of being a human being, but then hopefully you're also arriving at a point where we're like, we have some peace with this unended project.
Yeah. I like that definition, though. The idea that we're trying to find the meaning of these things.
Yeah.
And the meaning is entirely subjective to our values and what we think and what we've decided is, ethical and moral and all that kind of thing. So it's an interesting, because it's totally matters, right? And one other thing is that that the last conversation I had with Martin Bunzel about philosophy, he had said that, philosophy is the study of like the most fundamental questions.
Sure.
And I was like, oh, that's a good point. Like, you're studying the most basic question of, and the fact that it doesn't have an answer makes it so much more interesting, but also so much more frustrating. And therefore people are more likely to throw up their hands and distaste.
Yeah. I mean, there will be answers, and whether or not they are the final answer is the other thing, right?
Yeah.
So you will do philosophy, and you probably will reach a point where you either walk away from it or you go, I think I've got something that's going to work for me.
Yeah.
And it may be subjective. I don't know if you want to say it's entirely subjective, because then it comes out like it sounds we could be just making shit up, and it wouldn't really have any grounding in anything.
How would you word that then? If not subjective, then like it's up to human minds.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's fair too, right? That is what it technically would mean.
Because we're coming up with the definitions. We're coming up. So
sure. But in the process, we are engaging with something outside of our minds.
Sure. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And hopefully we're discovering something that is not just something we project.
Right.
Because then we would have unlimited. Well, I mean, and there are philosophers who say that we do this.
Right.
We have some radical social constructivist types who would say that every form of meaning is just a projection on something that is meaningless.
Right.
Which I would like to question that itself. Right. Yeah.
No, it's very depressing.
Yeah. No, right. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So I wouldn't say entirely subjective, but I would say that it is. Subjectivity is at the heart of what philosophy is about or should be about. And so we're trying to come up with a set of questions and answers that work for people at a subjective level. And those yet point probably beyond the subject to something else other than themselves.
Yeah.
I want to believe that anyway.
Totally. No, I think for me, since a couple of years ago, since I started to very lightly dabble in the idea of thinking philosophically from time to time, I think it has helped me in asking that question, be like, when I'm doing something, be like, wait, why ultimately am I doing this? Yeah. And sometimes the answer turns out to be, well, for some silly cultural reason that actually doesn't matter. And you go, oh, I can abandon this and it doesn't matter.
Yes.
And so I found it helpful in that way, almost it's almost like a mindfulness exercise in some ways. And so I found it helpful in that way.
Yes.
And so I think that's why I'm more interested in it now, and that it's kind of research into your own mind, or maybe not your mind, but well, I guess mind is the right word. Not your brain, but your mind, your consciousness. So, yeah.
And then the larger cultural aspects of all those minds coming together and doing weird things that they do. And then realizing that there are certain things that we might do culturally or individually that we might want to abandon and replace with something else. And of course, it'll always be a cultural thing and a mental thing that we are bringing back in to replace it with. But hopefully they're better ones. Yeah. And the better isn't, I don't want to say, ultimately relative to just whatever. It might be something that can be grounded solidly, or at least be resistant to falsification, or something that's robust.
Or at least more like hedging your bets when it comes to the future.
Yeah. So there's a number of different potential standards of evaluation that one can use in philosophy. And so I don't let my students just write whatever they want. Just tell me how they feel. It's like, well, I don't really care ultimately.
There is objective truths in this world.
We're going to try to do a better job of getting close to them if we can. Yeah, sure.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, cool. No, that's great. I think that was great. So now I want to move on to the next difficult question. It's funny. The first questions I think we're gonna answer.
What's
today.
Philosophy?
What's philosophy?
Do you have a couple of semesters or what?
No kidding, right? And then the first couple of questions here, I think the first half of this is going to be just like building up a framework so we can talk about the environment and the human relationship to it. So, okay, I want to next dive into morality, the concept of morality. Yep. What is it? Where does it come from? And how do we apply it? Because I think in the past morality was created for humans to govern themselves, and we've gotten to a place where society is doing well enough that we can consider non-human things, not just animals, but trees and plants and ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, let's start off small. Morality.
Yeah.
Small. Yeah. That's funny.
Sure. Of course. Yeah. I'm used to this.
Yeah. So I think we need to create that definition so that we can follow this train of thought. Okay. So can you explain morality, how you would define it so that we can have this discussion?
Oh, yeah. Well, if we're doing philosophy of what are the meanings of things, then morality is what is the meaning of the good, or what is the right thing to do. And so morality is just simply, if that is simple at all,
here we go.
trying to discover the right answer to questions of human behavior.
Right.
Like, how ought we to live?
Right.
And then there's a number of different frameworks that one might utilize to answer questions of that sort.
Right.
So.
Yeah. No, that's a nice, basic, simple. I think it makes sense. You can get into the definition of what is right and all that kind of thing. But
of course.
I think for the purpose of our conversation, doing the least amount of harm, is that a good way to put it? Or
it's one of them.
One of them? Okay.
Yeah. Harm minimization is a framework in ethics. By the way, ethics and morality generally are interchangeable in philosophy.
Okay.
One of them is a Greek translation, or a Greek word, and the other one's a Latin word that translates the Greek one. So they're not really fundamentally different. You can probably define them differently if you want, stipulatively, but so
people always say ethics and morals. So it's like, but now that, now that you say that.
And that's just, multiple languages coming together into ours.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which English is good at.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah. So harm minimization is a moral framework. Another one is a respect framework.
Respect framework.
That's and the classical. I shouldn't say classical because these are both highly modern theories of morality.
Sure.
Post Enlightenment, basically. Where you might say we should respect or treat people with respect, and it may not necessarily reduce harm to do so.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Or you could also be super patriarchal about how you're going to, or paternalistic, about how you're going to minimize harm, and you're going to minimize harm for people even if they don't want you to. And so then, right, you could impose the minimization of harm on others, and they wouldn't necessarily want you to. So the minimization of harm framework is generally considered or called utilitarianism. So we maximize pleasure and minimize pain for the greatest number of people, or things that can feel it.
Right.
Whereas the framework that is a respect framework is called deontology, which comes from a Greek word for duties. So we have moral duties regardless of the outcomes.
Interesting.
And that's based on the principle of the behavior of the action itself. So when people follow their principles, even though that might cause them to, lose something of great value to them, then they're being less of a harm minimizer and more of a respect ethics.
That makes sense. That makes it seem like it's more inclusive of non-sentient beings, right? Like, more, you know what I mean? Like morality, I think it seems like it was, like I said, it seems like it started, at least from my very uneducated philosophical perspective, it seems like it started with people and how do we govern people. And now it's, so defining it in that way seems like it can include a wider sphere of things.
Yeah. I mean, the harm minimization method does include things that have feelings,
right?
Or it's supposed to anyway.
Sure.
But then when you hit things like maybe trees and rocks and whatnot, then you're like, well, but then with the respect one, it's actually, there's an inverse problem because sometimes it's hard to see how you can respect anything if it can't respect you back. So if there's no reciprocity, then the respect people like, well, then there's nothing there to respect. But on the other hand, some of the environmental philosophers who work in this framework, they want to argue that there are things to respect about many things, even if they can't reciprocate.
Yeah, I have a gut revulsion to that first thing you said.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Me too. Yeah. No. So Immanuel Kant is the classic deontological respect ethicist, and he claims that only rational beings can be the object of your moral respect or moral regard, because only they can essentially be autonomous and respect you in return, or something of never mind that part. But but so it's a deeply anthropocentric position, but then trying to de-anthropocize it, to make it less about human centeredness or even rational object or agent centeredness. So it becomes less about subjects and more about recipients, I guess, or partners in relationships that are potentially respectful.
Right.
But harm is, you normally don't try to harm people that you respect. Well, and so there's ways that these can overlap nicely.
Yeah. It seems like, the respect thing makes total sense to me because it's more like, okay, so you don't have to, so in one sense, you don't have to respect a rock because it can't respect you, but also like, why disrespect that rock? Like as if it could be disrespected, but like, you could destroy the rock. It doesn't ultimately matter. Maybe not. But what was the purpose and what was the point and what was the like?
Yeah, and I'm drawn to that myself. Like I understand that the rock isn't going to reciprocate anything towards me,
right.
But I do feel like I can be disrespectful to rocks. Yeah. And I don't think. And
I was throwing rocks the other day into the river, skipping them. So like, is that?
I don't mean I'm not even yet clear to myself that is disrespectful necessarily, but there are. I want to be able to imagine in ways that I could perhaps work towards understanding how I could be good towards a rock.
I suppose sorry to cut you off, but I just had had a thought, I suppose to scale that up, you'd be like, okay, if you can be disrespectful to a rock, then you can be disrespectful to a mountain, and why not just plow it all down?
Exactly.
And you're like, well, all of a sudden that hurts a lot of people's feelings, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and then and that's often how the respect ethic has accounted for larger ecosystemic problems, is by saying that there are other human beings that are affected, and then so if you take somebody's cat and you do something horrible to that cat, you're not actually doing anything wrong to the cat necessarily, but you're doing something wrong to the person who owns the cat. But then it's like, okay, that's still anthropocentric, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because it's just, you're just treating their property badly.
Yeah.
And then you're disrespecting them by that. But no, I want to be open to the idea that there is in the world a lot of things to respect and to relate myself to appropriately.
Right.
And in many cases that might mean not harming them, or not harming them without reason or whatever.
Yeah.
But sometimes it won't involve harm so much as again, we do struggle though linguistically with this. And a large part of that is because Western philosophy that has been around for several thousand years hasn't really been in the business of granting rights to rocks,
right,
or whatever, stuff like this, right?
Yeah.
So it's a new thing.
When I step outside myself, when I think about the conversation we're having right now, I'm like, what are we doing?
Right?
What did we do? What is the purpose of this?
Yeah.
But it's a grander scheme. And like, eventually I want to get to the topic of like, do we have an obligation a moral obligation to plants and to trees and to the ecosystem as a whole, right? And so that's where I want to go. And so I think in order to have that conversation, we need to have this discussion about morality and how we can extend it.
For sure.
And in a lot of your papers, you were talking about the sphere of morality.
Yeah.
And how it has been expanding over time to include more and more. And in the papers I read that you sent me, it was more about non-human animals. And also, I very much like that concept. It took me a second to realize the purpose of saying non-human animal.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, you're right. Like that, all of a sudden that takes the person from, if you say, oh, animals and humans, but you say not a human animal and human animal, all of a sudden it puts you in the same category and you go, oh, it's a different brain space to be thinking about, a deer or a shrew as the same category as a human, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the circle of morality expanding over time, and that's a thing that I struggle with philosophically, because on one hand, I that's why I do say non-human animal, because I want to include myself and us in the sphere of animality. Right.
Which we are scientifically even, right? There's no,
it shouldn't be a problem to do this, right? But linguistically, we have been in the habit of not doing this.
Yes.
On the other hand, I find it difficult to say that ethics starts out with this core of, I guess, a human, maybe an individual, and then it gets expanded over time to include more and more things, right?
Yes.
So that eventually the human just becomes everything. And you're like, oh, okay. So the expanding circle metaphor does come from a harm minimization philosopher, Peter Singer. And he says we all start out as egoists. Each one of us is an individualistic little prick, and we don't want to.
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. But eventually we're like, well, it's probably in my best interest to cooperate nicely with strangers.
Right.
And then, then the family starts to build outward, and then we get the clan and the tribe and then whatever. And so we start granting these people, moral standing. But then, only our group, right? And then eventually, what about other groups, know? And then he says, well, eventually that circle has to keep expanding to include things like animals.
Right. First your pet.
Probably.
Then your cow and your pig and and the things that you,
And then maybe whales.
Right.
Right. Well, for sure for him, whales. But there's a point where but the circle has to stop expanding because the things don't have the feelings that are required to have what he thinks make you important.
Right.
So he draws the line somewhere between shrimp and clams.
That's so ambiguous.
Yeah. Right. So maybe it's a few clams and rocks, right? But what about rocks and, anyway, so I find it to be a problem in a couple of ways. Number one, it does sound like the circle has to stop expanding at some point. And then after that, then everything on the outside is just raw material that you can make into property. And then it's morally significant as property at most.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, I don't know if that's going to do it for me. But then on the other hand, too, when you take at the core an individual selfish jerk and then just expand that selfish jerk to include everyone else, we're all a bunch of selfish people, but we have a big sense of self now. I'm like, I feel like this could be an imposition of a certain kind of moral attitude about oneself and then just assume or project that onto things that maybe it doesn't fit on very well.
Yeah. It does seem, it seems to miss a fundamental point in my mind in that, individuals do not exist in a vacuum. Every decision you make or do not make has an effect on everyone around you. Yeah. And that includes plants and trees and everything else. So I think that it does seem to be more like, well, it doesn't matter what I do to the environment because I'm okay. Like it only matters what I do to things that can think. And you're like, well, but if the earth is a closed system, then that doesn't really work out.
No. Yeah. The individualistic framework that's at the heart of the utilitarian theory comes from a moment in European history where the individual was being asserted as in opposition to the power of the king and the classes or whatever. And there's reasons for why they chose the individual as this unit of moral responsibility, but it doesn't do much for relationality and understanding how connections matter. Unless they are just, because I need them for my own, right? So fine. But that framework doesn't take relationality as fundamental. It takes the individual in isolation as fundamental. And I think that might be a problem because if we do look at the way the world is and the earth itself and all the things in it, relationality might be fundamentally real. It's the basic.
I feel it is. It makes like everything is in balance and flux and and then there are some places in the Western tradition where that can be taken from. But maybe other traditions outside Western philosophy might even do a better job of that yet. Yeah. But I think it's important to be skeptical, I think, of individualistic, atomistic, itemized unitary kind of presuppositions that then we try to expand outward and include everything in. I feel like the respect approach to ethics can be utilized nicely in a framework where relationality is also the fundamental nature of things. And so what we do is we respect relations between things. Yeah, I like that.
And maybe that's maybe a better ethical framework to utilize for trees and us.
It feels better, doesn't it?
I feel like it feels better, but we might have to say a bit more about why it should feel better.
Right. Yeah.
But there's only so much time, and I don't know if I'm prepared yet for that.
Yeah. Well, funnily enough, I think that's where I want to go next.
Okay. That's fine.
I think having done that, I think I want to dive into your perspective on the human relationship to nature and how you propose, or at least the different, arguing parts of your mind that propose how we should relate ourselves to nature.
Well, that's another big one, right?
This is a problem with philosophy. Everything's a big question.
I accept this. I embrace it, even though it makes me uncomfortable sometimes. That's what philosophy should do.
Right.
I think Heidegger said something like, if you're not having anxiety when you're philosophizing, you're not doing it right, sort of thing.
Right.
Okay. I'm not, but don't worry, I'm not having an anxiety attack right now. It's all good. It's all good. How do I think we should relate to nature? I think I want to say I want us to fit in. I want to feel like I'm a part of a bigger set of relations.
Right. Why do you feel that way?
Well, if I don't feel like I have a sense of belonging to something, then I think I lose a sense of meaning. So meaning, I think really does boil down to what are you connected to.
Right.
If you have some sounds that come out of your mouth and they aren't connected to anything, then they're meaningless sounds. Right? Right. But as soon as sometimes in language we think, well, that's just a random stipulation that the sound cat actually is connected to this fuzzy little purring thing. Because cats don't actually sound like the word cat sounds.
Right. We decided that cat is the word we use for this thing that exists.
So that's an arbitrary stipulation, right? And so at some level we might think that all meaning is arbitrary stipulation, but I don't. But then I go, well, then if everything's arbitrary, then there's no real reason for anything to be connected to anything. And then I'm like, well, I'm back to my starting point of me being isolated and alone, floating in the void of nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, why don't I just die then?
What's the point
exactly,
of it all?
right?
Yeah.
So I think relatedness and belonging is the fundamental place to find meaning.
Yeah.
And so, if I'm going to relate to nature, then I want to find myself related to it in an embedded sense where I sort of fit in a way to what's already there, and also in a sense that's bigger than me.
Yeah.
And that means it's not a result of my arbitrary stipulations, because it's pre me. It's already there. It's already constitutive of many of my relations. It makes me what I am in some ways. So my identity comes from it rather than is constructed in opposition to it.
Okay. Yeah.
Generally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So right. There's a really fast answer to your really big question. There's more to be said, of course.
And it's a loaded question. Like I think I knew where you were going to go with it. I assumed, right? Having reading your stuff, I knew that you were like, a balanced fellow trying to, And I think most of my listeners will feel the same way, right? Yeah. And I kind of wanted to seek into why. So why do you think? So I get the gist that, for sure, that you feel we are morally obligated to respect, I'll use that word, non-human animals. Mm-hmm. Do you also feel that we are morally obligated, therefore, to respect non-sentient creatures? Creatures that do not have a nervous system, creatures like other living things that are, like I said, trees, grass, fungi, whatever, right? Things that, do we have a moral obligation to respect? Well, we'll just use respect.
Yeah, I'll be happy to do that.
To respect those things, yeah.
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
It's fun. Right behind you is a big tree picture. I don't know if that's a redwood or a cedar or what, but I can imagine myself doing things that are disrespectful to that tree.
Sure. And
then I would imagine myself feeling bad about that.
Sure.
At least after I realized what I was doing, perhaps. I want to be able to respect waterways. I want to be able to respect ecosystems and all sorts of things. So, and I don't have to, I think, believe that somehow what I'm respecting is a mind inside it. I don't think I'm a panpsychist necessarily.
Panpsychist. I don't even know what that means.
So there's soul everywhere, right?
Soul everywhere. Okay.
Yeah. So there's like a spirit in the tree, right? But there could be. I mean, I don't know. And then I know there's many cultural frameworks that think something of that sort.
I'm reading Ender's Game right now, the second and third book, and they're all about souls and trees and stuff. So it's funny. It's funny that we're having this conversation.
I think I only read the second one. I don't think I got to the third. Speaker of the Dead's the second one, right?
Speaker of the Dead's really good. Yeah.
I really like that one, but that's the only two I read.
There's two more. You should get into them.
Oh yeah.
They're very philosophical.
They are indeed. Yeah. I feel it's possible to disrespect my washing machine in a way. Right?
It sounds so absurd.
It does, but I'm like, well, and then of course, because it does sound absurd when I say that, then people often respond, well, who cares? Right?
Who is this guy? Yeah. Why are we listening to him?
But then I ask myself, well, why would somebody want to do that to a washing machine?
What's the point? What's the purpose?
And what kind of person does that? And that's the third, I suppose, moral framework too, is what kind of people do these kinds of things? And so it's not necessarily just your respect necessarily, or your harm minimization or not, but it's your character. And so it may reflect on one's character to relate oneself to a tree in a particular way or not.
Yeah.
Like one example I remember of that I think is pretty helpful with disrespecting trees is the drive-through sequoia.
Oh, right.
Yeah. And clearly it's not going to help the tree stand up for a super long time because didn't it eventually fall over?
I don't know for sure. So
maybe it hasn't.
Yeah, because it's a giant sequoia that with the hole in the middle of the bottom was so big that you could drive your car through it.
Did they cut one though? Or was it a pre-existing hole?
I can't say. No. It was a pre-existing hole.
Oh, see, I thought they cut one.
What happened, what I'm guessing happened is a giant sequoia or some tree had fallen over. And from the top of that or through the rot of that grew another sequoia. Oh. But as it grew, the tree underneath it slowly rotted out, leaving this giant hole. Yeah. Right? I think that was the explanation I've been told. Yeah. So it was a quote unquote natural thing.
Okay. Yeah.
But driving your car through it probably super not helping.
Yeah. See, I don't know if it's then helpful. It may not be harmful to the individual tree, but I find that the attitude of just me having a little automobile party through this tree is somewhat less. It's trite, I guess. Maybe it's not less trite. It is less than what I ought to be. I should be in awe of this thing, less than more so than going, oh, I'm gonna have a little party. Woo. Yeah. I mean, it is fun. I think it's okay to play.
It's very theme parky.
Yeah. Right. And so there's play with trees, and then there's just not really caring and thinking about how cool it is. So, and then of course,
absent-minded kind of.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we were saying earlier about the mindfulness thing.
Yeah. Just doing something without thinking about what you're actually doing or the context of it.
And I'm sure that we often do that anyway, but there's a point where we have to also remember and
totally
be circumspect around certain things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So now, we talk about the human relationship to nature and what we feel like it should be. However, humans, we extract from nature.
Yep.
Right. So how do we hierarchy the needs of, and I don't like even saying the word hierarchy because it makes it sound like there is a hierarchy, but the truth is that we do have to, if we're going to balance and be a part of nature, we're going to live within it. And, we have to make decisions about, okay, we do need to extract things from nature. Whether you're a hunter, you're extracting animals, or an angler, you're extracting fish, or you're a forager, or you're a logger, or you're extracting rare earth minerals so that we can talk globally, right? These are all things that we've decided as a culture need to happen. So how do we do this? So how do you propose that we create a framework to like hierarchy these ideas and balance them in a way that is balanced and not just like ultimately, because I feel like up until very recently, and maybe even still to a large part is that, ultimately when we came up to that question, it was always like, well, our needs trump the needs of X. Therefore, we'll just trample this or dig this up and it's fine. Don't worry about it. There's more elsewhere. So how do we think about the fact that we need to extract from nature as well as be a part of it? Yeah.
Well, at the bottom, at the basic level, extracting from nature is being a part of it because nature is
part of the flux.
All of it's extracting, and that is the flux of it, right?
Yeah.
I think philosophers don't really have as much expertise necessarily here compared to some scientists who would be able to tell me. So I should have mentioned this earlier too, is that philosophy doesn't exist free floating. Especially philosophy of nature, it has to be involved in an ongoing conversation with people who know things about facts.
Yeah.
Right. So I actually thought the drive-through Sequoia was cut.
It might have been. Yeah. It might have been. I'm not sure.
But I didn't know, and I'm not a forester. But so these are the things. What are the meaning of facts, though? Is of course what we're trying to do. So I want to say that there are going to be ways to extract resources from the environment, from the ecosystem, from species, from even sometimes individuals, that are going to be less destructive, perhaps, consistent with the nature of the thing you're extracting from, that allows that nature to continue in a way.
I guess less absent-minded.
Yeah,
again,
right? Yeah.
Again, just like doing things mindfully, understanding the full consequences of your actions before making that decision.
Yep. Yeah. And then there will be, when we are aware of what some of those consequences are, we might recognize then that some of them are unacceptable consequences.
Yeah.
And on unacceptable on what grounds? And frequently, and for thousands of years, Western society, at least, if not many others, have said, well, those standards are just us and what we want.
What we decide is true.
Yeah.
And you're like,
yeah.
Okay,
so
that's a very lazy way to think about it,
right.
but sure.
Yeah. And I think, we do have needs, but we also have things that we don't need, but we want. And that's
want is capitalism at its heart.
Yeah. So there are some, right. And so frankly, will be times, I think, where our ethics will have to tell us to not be capitalist or not be capitalist in the way that we are being capitalist.
Yeah.
So ethics is a limit on behavior. It doesn't say you can do whatever you want.
Right.
And so ethics will say at some point, no, we will have to not do that. And some people will do it anyway. And and ethics is like, that's bad. And we will have to respond in some form that will allow us to hopefully overcome that. So with extracting resources, then, one of them I think would be sustainability. I don't like using that word because it's way too trite in a way. It's almost like it's unthinking to say it. But I don't want to extract so many resources out of an ecosystem that the ecosystem is impoverished or polluted. So I don't want a mountaintop mine, right?
Right.
I'm not opposed to mines per se. But I think that there's ways of doing mining that are less horrific.
Yeah.
Maybe all forms of mining could potentially be, shockingly rejected maybe, but I'm not willing to go there yet, but I can be convinced if I realize what's the implication of any mine at all. Okay, fine. Cutting down trees, I feel like that's possible to be done in a way that we could even respect the tree in the way as it comes down, individually, sure. But also I think as the tree is a member of a species of trees, maybe if it's the last tree of that kind, it's like, maybe that's not one we chop down, right? Sure. Maybe if this tree is part of a native ecosystem here, then when we replant it, perhaps we replant it with another one of the same sort.
Yeah.
Rather than looking for the ones that grow the fastest and sure. Whatever we do, to maximize board feet per year or something. I don't know how this works.
Yeah.
You do.
You're getting close. Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
It's like vaguely
tracking. Yeah.
Right. And then same with fisheries and fish. And then even in the moment of the actual fish catching, there, I think are, even rituals that one can enact that change the way I relate to it.
Yeah.
And then that causes a kind of mindfulness, perhaps, that allows us to answer questions about bigger things, that we maybe wouldn't ask in the first place otherwise.
I think that's interesting. What comes to mind is, I spoke with, I forget where this is coming from, but I think it was from one of the, indigenous community forests, mm-hmm. where they manage their forests their way, however they, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, they do harvest and all that kind of thing, mm-hmm. but because it's an indigenously managed, they have their own ceremony. It's not like they have a ceremony around every tree, mm-hmm. but they have a ceremony around every concept and giving back. So I think they, mm-hmm. They do they'll gift sage or they'll gift tobacco or whatever. But I think it's more the mind space that it requires to go, okay, I'm going to remove this resource because we need it for this, X, Y, and Z. And we're going to replant. And a lot of people will go, that's enough. Yep. Like we're making sure this is sustainable. We're replanting what we cut and we're making sure it's the same species and the ecology is remaining as much as we can possibly using human means of disturbance. But
sure.
The mind space of someone thinking about it in that way, thinking about it like, okay, I'm going to give back, even though I know that giving some sage or giving whatever may not be ecologically as significant.
Sure.
It does paint a picture in the community's mind as to what this interaction was.
Yep.
Versus instead of being like, we removed this resource, we replanted. It's all good. Don't worry about it.
Yes. And I think that all good, don't worry about it is the thing that I'm hopeful that we won't have to continue on with.
Right.
Yeah. The transformation of the person's own sense or their subjective sense of connection and belonging will be radically different. Even maybe the outcomes aren't any different.
No. Yeah.
But maybe they will, or maybe in unpredicted ways, we will discover things about ourselves and how we relate to the world, and how that changes because we've already changed how we subjectively feel, in our relationship with it because of things that we've done or how we understand our activity.
I think if you change your mind and if your way of perceiving those things, it's inevitable that you're going to change the way you interact with nature, right? With the other.
Either that or you're going to realize that you're really sad that you can't.
Yeah.
Which does, there are times where like, boy, I wish now that I have this awareness of things, I wish I could do things differently. And then I don't know how.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, what am I going to do? I have to drive my car to work or whatever, not necessarily, but things like that, right? I have to get.
Well, especially, something like that. Yeah. Like that's something that's come up often, right? Like, we talk about sustainability, and I think about I do not live a sustainable lifestyle.
No, me neither. And it's really frustrating. Yeah. And there's things I can do. I try a little bit here and there, but it never feels enough.
No, never. Well, it never feels enough. And also, like, I feel like we're like living in one of the most northern cities in the world. Mm-hmm. It's like minus 45 is a challenge for an electric car or for whatever, right? And like there's certain and our cities aren't designed for and it's just there's all kinds of challenges that come with that. But I find myself being always very aware of the fact of that I am an unsustainably living human being. Talking about how we should be more sustainable, like definitely not living the life, right? But like I'm always very aware of the hypocrisy of that. And
sure, but it's a fruitful hypocrisy, right? Because you wouldn't be even doing anything. You wouldn't be trying to do anything different if you weren't already in that headspace.
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
So it's not a comfortable headspace to be in, but it's a good headspace because it's better than not realizing you're in this problem in the first place, right? So, And
took the first step,
right? It's a first step, and we're it's an ongoing process, and we're not sure how it's going to end or what is the next step.
Sure,
but at least we are aware that there should be steps, and we're looking.
Look at us congratulating ourselves.
Yeah,
pat yourself on the back.
It's important to feel some guilt, and it's important not to be crippled by it.
Absolutely. That brings up the concept of the Anthropocene or how do you say it?
Oh, I say Anthropocene.
Anthropocene?
Anthropo, yeah.
Anthropocene. So the idea that we are in a new epoch of time in which humans are what's the word? We're the main contributor to the change in
we're the largest geological force on the planet.
Yes, so there you go. We're the largest geological force on the planet.
That's how it goes.
Yeah, so we are the thing causing the most change. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, I realized I've never really defined an anthropocentric, right? And I realized, okay, so it's something we should say. Anthro is just human, right? Yep. And then centric, it just means that we're at the center of it. Yep. So just saying that, like, anytime I say the word anthropocentric, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about human-centeredness, Yep. And so the Anthropocene is that. Mm-hmm. Anthropocene. It's going to take me a while to get that.
You know what? It's a Greek-sounding word, and it's said in English, so I don't know what the proper way to do that would be. Right. I think in Greek it's anthropos, which is human being, and then anthropocene would be the most Greek-sounding English version of that. But I don't know if that's really
language. Always nonsensical.
And English is a tough one among many.
So in the age of the Anthropocene, where we are now, where we are the biggest geological force on the planet, I feel like these ideas of morals and obligations to nature become a little more clear, because it becomes clear that we are undoubtedly, like science has proven time and time again, we are changing the world, period. We are. Yep. We're having huge impacts, and at some point down the line, that will directly affect the way we live. Yep. And it won't be, and for a lot of people, it won't be till that point when it's too late.
Sure.
That we'll realize, shit, maybe we should have thought. So like whether we're trying to hedge our bets here and get ahead. So when we're talking about morality and nature and the Anthropocene, how does that change? How does that change the way we should consider it?
I think. Yeah, there's a funny thing about the Anthropocene is because on the one hand, it was, I think, coined by these geologists. Was it Paul Crutzen was one of them? I don't know. I have a bad memory. Anyway, it was coined as a warning word. It was a word that was supposed to scare people.
Yeah.
And then oddly, it sort of became amongst many folk in, I think, environmental studies maybe, or environmental humanities. It was like, woohoo! Yeah. It was a triumphalist thing. Finally, we are
the masters of our domain.
Right. Yeah. And this is great now because look at all the things we can do, and it's no longer us having to somehow fit in within a pre-existing framework of limits that the world was. We are now the creator of the new world.
We decide what this is going to be.
And so that strikes me just rampant anthropocentrism. And so I'm not a triumphalist Anthropocene person.
That was a hell of a sentence. Triumphalist.
It wasn't even a good. I had to throw person in there so that it made sense. Because I couldn't come up with a way to turn it into an adjective. I'm not an Anthropocentrist.
You're not excited about the Anthropocene.
No, I'm not. I'm horrified by it. And so I think in that sense, then I think you're right. Our ethical responsibilities are even more evident, or should be more evident.
Right. There's scientific fact. It's not just a thought now of like, we deforested here, or did this, that, or whatever. It's like, no, they're like, by any way we can measure it, we're having a ridiculous impact. Yeah.
Right. And then a bad one.
Yeah.
Right. And I at least that's what I want to think that's the point of it. But then the triumphalist types would say, well, no, we'll just adapt and
but we're respond. The masters. We can change it. It's
exactly.
Fine.
We can make it. We can bring it back if we want to. Right. We can. Yeah. And I don't know if they're right about that. And even if they are, I don't know if that's the right attitude to have. I feel like it isn't. Don't yet know if I have a good explanation of why it's not.
I think for the same reason that we can't sort out the answers to philosophy is the same reason that we shouldn't be responsible for measuring the flux of the entire world.
There you go. Yeah, all right. Okay, that's fair. Yeah. I like that actually. Yeah, okay. And there should be a limit to our abilities to understand things, not only philosophically, but even ecologically.
Yeah.
And then because we would have to be some sort of creative god to, I think.
That's the word that comes to my mind too. It's like, we're not gods.
Yeah.
We're just like trying shit and hoping it works, and then we adjust course. And it's like, but it's possible to try shit long enough that it just screws everything up and there's no going back.
Yeah. and then to fix it in a way that would be adequate would probably involve something that would require some divine power, which we lack.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not for lack of trying though. I mean, because that is part of the reason we ended up here, is because we spent a long time aiming for that.
Yeah.
But anyway, it goes back to, I think, what I was getting at earlier with that expanding circle metaphor.
Yes. Yep.
Is that the circle has been expanded, but not really in the sense of ethics so much as human power to impose our image on something else. So when we were talking about the expanding circle of ethics, we were saying, the egoist at the center is now there's a lot more of these egoists, and we're going to work together to be a big superego. I'm like, okay, this is probably not a good model yet, because we've still taken this individualistic, isolated atom and then said everything is like this. But now with the Anthropocene, what we haven't done is said that's the model of ethics so much as we will take a power-seeking individual core and then just make everything into an image of that, such that the universe or the world that we live in is the source of all the things that we want, and we can suck out of it anything that we desire and transform it into anything that we want. It becomes a mirror of our desires and our will to power. And so it'll be a completely tamed world. I mean, it might turn into Coruscant eventually.
I was just thinking Coruscant, right? Yeah, Star Wars, right?
Yeah. So, and if that's fine, then that's fine because, apparently the image of humanity that imposes itself on that world is one of just what I want. It's so. There's a nice quote from another philosopher who does work on hunting, Gregory Clark. In my little book, he wrote a paper on Bambi, but this is not from that particular chapter. Yeah. He said, the problem with anthropocentrism is that not that it puts humans at the center, but that it put assholes at the center. And I was like, thank you for using that word in a philosophical publication. That is why it's legitimate and precise and good. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that when we take a model of humanity that is exploitative and power seeking and dominating and other bad things.
Yeah.
And then we say, now this is the nature of the planet that we have created because we have all this power to do so. Then we've made a planet, and we're in the process of making a planet where there's nothing but not just us, but a really screwed up version of us.
Right. For some reason, every time you talk about the sphere of ethics, the sphere of morality, excuse me.
You need a glass of water too there, Matt.
I know.
You did. Yeah,
I do have one. But the sphere of morality expanding outwards from the ego.
Yeah.
I'm struck by something, and I think I got this from some science fiction novel, so it definitely doesn't apply. But I'm going to think about it anyways, because we're talking about philosophy. So you never know what might be.
Exactly. Right? Sci-fi is a fecund place to investigate and get ideas from.
Right. Like I like to think that, I mean, the universe, the cosmos, the world is what it is. Mm-hmm. And philosophy and science is just us slowly figuring out what it is. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're deciding what it is. It's not
right.
Yeah. And so I like to think that the expanding sphere is not just. I like to think the opposite. Right. It's almost like it is what it is, and it's coming down.
Oh,
right?
That's very nice. Yeah.
But I don't know how that changes. Yeah. So the sphere is getting smaller towards people, and then we're slowly just discovering how big the sphere actually is.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's helpful in thinking about this, but it's...
Huh. No, I think it might be.
Yeah. I don't even know where to go with that.
Well, because if like what I was saying earlier about the way I want to think we should relate to nature is to somehow fit into a larger framework.
Sure. Yeah.
Then if the way things are is what it is, and it is narrowing down and to us, and then I see myself as this part of it connected to it.
Yeah.
And I respond to it as pre-existing and authoritative in some sense.
Yeah.
And whereas if it's the other way around, where I start, if I'm the Archimedean point that pivots the universe, and then outward I grow, I am the nature of all things,
right.
and I make everything else somehow turn into something that works for me. So I'm not the center of the universe. If the universe is what is moving down and how does
the universe has culminated into creating a being that can contemplate itself, right? Yeah. So, but we are still just, it's like that classic Neil deGrasse Tyson, or maybe it's Carl Sagan quote, right? Like we are just one way in which stardust and the universe
self-conscious
is learned. Yeah. We are the embodiment of the universe thinking about itself, which is true.
Yep.
We are just the culmination of stardust that now can think. And you're like, but yeah, I think it's...
But then that stardust, when it starts to get these delusions of grandeur that it says...
that we're important.
Yeah.
Well, I was just thinking that. I was like, it seems pretty... It's hilarious of us to think that it would come down to us at all.
Right. Well, that's the culmination language is
we're just another deer, but we happen to have thumbs and the ability to... We're just that. But we think that we're important. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it is cool that we can do that, and we can think about this, but I don't know if the universe was trying to pop us out. The universe is straining towards humanity, and because then we can see ourselves as the apex of it again.
Right, we're the apex again. Yeah,
right. And so that's why culminating might be.
No matter what way we think about it, we're at the center of it.
Right. Well, and then from our own perspective, we have to be right because we are a focal point of our own experience. But the fun thing about experience is that you realize that it's experience of things outside of you. And so you're not making those experiences up. And so they come from beyond. Right. And I think so from within a perspective that is anthropic, we are human beings looking at the world as human beings. We recognize the other than the human. And that's, I think, the starting point for respect and belonging and fitting. And that's not really what the Anthropocene story was about. It was...
No.
Yeah.
I think what summarizes the Anthropocene story that you wrote was... just 3 words: Anthropocene as violence.
Oh yeah.
And when I read that quote, I was like, it is. Yeah. Like, it's just us imposing our will.
Yeah.
And in some ways, like in a lot of ways, we've learned to, I would say, I guess it's maybe not entirely fair to say that, because you wouldn't say that of a hunter-gatherer society, right?
No.
But we've scaled it up.
Right.
To include more and more people. And in that sense, we have to do more farming. We have to do more this, that, and the other thing. However, from the perspective of a squirrel or from a tree or from a whatever non-human thing, the Anthropocene is violence to them, right? So that was an interesting perspective changer for me.
Okay. Yeah.
That that sentence. It's it was nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I got that notion of violence from a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who says that, violence is unethical, essentially. But what he means by violence is the imposition of the self onto the other. So, it's kind of like narcissism.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's again, absent-minded action.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I see another person and I don't see them, I see myself. Yeah. That's violence for him. And then there's all sorts of ways that you can enact this, right? Yeah. You can make that other person into a mirror of yourself, or you can force them to be a slave, or you can do all these horrible things to them so that they become somehow subservient to you. And that's violence. Violence is the overcoming of the other with the same.
Yeah.
And then,
fascinating.
And that's the asshole at the center.
It is funny because I like contemplating these ideas of the philosophical nature of things, because I think it just like it likes to, it takes us out of what we assume to be true. Right? Or just the assumptions that we make about reality, and makes us question those things. And when you start to question those things, you start to go, oh yeah, like maybe that's not the right way to think about this. And I find myself, I fall out of that headspace pretty quickly and back into normal day-to-day life.
Well, yeah, we do. We have lives to live. We have jobs to do. And
especially when you're talking politics or whatever else, right? Like you just fall out of it immediately. And it's all about what makes a tangible difference, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I find that's the value of philosophy for me in that sense. It just allows you to begin to think about non-egotistical narcissism, right? It allows you to step out of narcissism and think about other things as having value, even though they may not have a nervous system or whatever. Yeah.
That's why when I teach philosophy, I'm not trying to get my students to become profs, because there's only so many of those out there. And maybe you don't need too many, but I want them to be philosophical in their life going forward, which is a bit of a curse and hopefully also a bit of a blessing. Because the curse is like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be second guessing everything about myself constantly now, and I'll never really know anything for sure. And you lose this maybe sense of confidence, but then it's not actual confidence you're losing, but more arrogance, perhaps.
Yeah, I hope. Totally. Yeah. Confidence. That's a good way of putting it. I like that way of putting it, because confidence in and of itself is just arrogance in a lot of ways.
I think often, we conflate the two of them for sure. Yeah. And then people we think are confident are just actual, arrogant. But confidence is faith in a way, but arrogance is not, because it's I just know that I'm awesome.
Yeah, faith and arrogance. Yeah,
but where a confident person might be just like, well, I'm pretty sure I'm okay with this, and I can do this well, and I don't know for sure, and it's tentative perhaps. Yeah. But yeah. So anyway, philosophy can temper some of your arrogance, I hope, and then. When you do, then your regular life, it's somewhat transformed.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it gets you out of your own head for a second, right? Yeah. And you can, again, I relate it to mindfulness practice, right? And being able to step out of the chaos of the day and go, oh yeah, this is what's actually going on right now. I'm not in my head. I'm actually in the world, and I can step out of my head for a second and go, this is pretty nice or whatever. But yeah, I think philosophy allows us to do that a little bit. It's funny. When I go into recordings with people, I often create like a storyboard, right? Of like where I think I want things to go. Oh yeah. And I'm always looking for ways to like summarize at the end, so people have like things to take away from, right? Yeah. And with this one, I didn't even bother, because I was like, I'm gonna let Nathan tell me what's up, and we'll see where we go. Because I think just talk, like you said at the beginning, I think there's fundamental value in just thinking about things. Yeah. And that in and of itself might be enough to just get people to think more in different ways and challenge themselves and feel uncomfortable and anxious and live with that and think about that. And why are you anxious? Why are you uncomfortable? And challenge yourself to not just like, placate the world and be like, well, it is what it is because I like it and this is what I want. And
No, I think that's what you've summarized up there is what one philosopher, Heidegger, says is what it is to be a philosopher. Is to live in the being held out into this uncomfortable position, where I'm hovering over the world in a way, but also realizing that it's a tentative or tenuous position. Really, I'm terrified in a way of being out here.
Why am I here? I don't deserve this.
Yeah, I think, whoa! But then what you realize is the strange beauty of being. You're like, wow, and how did I get here? And the fact that I'm amongst it all, being able to see it is freaking crazy and
makes
cool.
you very thankful. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So there's a gratitude towards reality in a sense because we're aware of it in this heightened, strange, new way.
Maybe that's why we're drawn to it.
Yeah, I think so.
Philosophy, because it brings us new meaning and brings us, more beauty and good feelings.
Yeah, sure. Some of them are good. Yeah. Well, I think it's overall good. Yeah. But not, some of us aren't drawn to it, I'm sure. But, but that's the philosophical life.
Yeah.
Is to see it, see the world with those fresh eyes and you're in awe of the mystery of it all. And you're kind of, it's mind-blowingly great.
Yeah.
Just, I love the fact that I've got trees behind your head that I leave to look at. Because I was just like, damn.
These help, these giant printouts of random nature. Yeah, they definitely help get in the headspace of
they were
of the importance of the things that are non-human, right?
Yeah.
No, I agree. It is funny how it's like myself, I'm not a religious person. But I grew up Catholic, I grew up religious, right? And grew up with those concepts. And I never really took to it, never really believed it, never really had faith in it. It was just kind of what you did.
Yeah.
But I always felt that there was spirituality and like how I feel about something is important and it matters and it does make a difference. These are two places. This is a place where I feel that belief, or even, organized religion and science kind of start to merge a little bit because it starts to be about why is it important? And you're like, well,
yeah.
And so I find there's value there as well. It's interesting to notice where two things are normally at odds with one another, where they start to merge and you go, maybe it's more complicated than you think.
For sure. Yeah. And there's very bad ways to do religion, but there's better ways too.
Sure.
Well, I think even, again, Heidegger said that thinking is piety. It's a form of
piety. I don't even know what that word is. What is piety?
Piety is the way that which a religious person who is pious.
That's
how they comport or they direct themselves towards the God.
So they're like, is that like
praying or practicing, going to mass or whatever they do,
like subjugate to the God?
So the way they organize their life in a way that is respectful or circumspect when they're in proximity to the divine.
Okay, say that sentence again now.
So thinking is piety.
Thinking is piety.
Thinking being, of course, philosophical Heideggerian thinking,
right?
Or whatever.
Oh, I see.
But to be that kind of awareness about life and being and one's place in nature, etc. That is good religion, you might want to call it.
Yeah.
That's spirituality. You could say that. Philosophy of spirituality, perhaps, is another way of putting it. I'm just making this up now.
Right. No, sure.
The spot. But yeah, to the proper way to orient oneself towards the real is thinking carefully about it, I guess. Something like that?
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good to me. I like it. Yeah, that's great.
And that may become expressed in one's religious practice as well. It might become just expressed in one's day-to-day life, which honestly religion is supposed to be a part of anyway. So there's lots of different ways to do that. They can come out in your poetry, come out in your forestry, goodness knows.
Yeah. Just this expression of emotion and that. Yeah, totally. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's funny. I was tentative to talk about this only because it's I have listeners around the globe. It's a lot of Canadian, a lot of American, but there's a lot from elsewhere as well. But I think I'm going to talk about it anyways because it's a unique example. I forget which essay it was from. The Canadian ideas of nature.
Oh yeah, the going outside one.
Going outside one. Yeah. So you had described how the Canadian idea of nature is very unique in the world in that Canadian culture is, you use the word porous to nature.
Yep.
So like nature it's everywhere in Canadian culture. Our cities were built in and around nature instead of so much. Whereas like you explained it as like you're like the Netherlands was basically paved over, and then you build high rises, and there might be a couple of trees growing out of the pavement. Whereas in Edmonton, for example, or Calgary and Alberta here, the cities there's just, if you take it above, if you were to fly over, you see mostly trees. And then there's buildings in there, and you see the big river valley, and you see these giant. And so you were discussing nature as being part of our culture and how that's very unique in that most other cultures don't have that. They have islands of nature, and they're surrounded by the Anthropocene. They're surrounded by people, and anything leaves that island of nature, it's probably going to die. Whereas in Canada, you could leave Banff as a bison or whatever. You could leave Jasper, and you could walk into the bush, and you could live the rest of your life and probably never encounter a negative experience with a human if you were careful, right?
Yeah.
Like there's forest everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to discuss that idea of the Canadian idea of nature and why that's important and what that can provide us when we're talking about the Anthropocene and our relationship to nature.
I guess I shouldn't say that we're the only place on the planet that has this.
No, not the only.
And I don't know. I mean, but it's a huge landmass, and there's
well, Russia's got a lot of boreal forests as well. I'm sure.
Yeah, so Russia's bigger.
I'm sure large parts of Russia is that way, and
I wish I knew more about what it was like. Yeah. So Iceland, I imagine there's
Greenland,
similarities.
Not forested, but still like relatively. There's places, but it's
So I mean, I think Canadian experience of nature is different than American experience of nature, at least the lower 48.
Big time.
And in much of Western Europe, maybe Southern Europe, maybe Eastern Europe to some degree too. Because generally what we have is on a map, the entirety of the country seems to be forest or plains or something that's hanging over top of where the thin layer of people happen to be concentrated.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean there's no people in the rest of Canada. That's actually, Canada was full of people before Canada was a thing.
Yeah.
But the Canada that got built by settlers, reached a point where it could not turn Canada into a really good mimic of Europe.
Right.
Tried.
Tried hard.
And tried real hard, and atrocities were committed. And in some parts of Canada, it is, successful.
Yeah.
Which is not a good success, but okay.
No, successful from that settlement standpoint.
Yeah. But it's as if the project of conquest reached its limit somehow in Canada.
Yeah.
Where the settler Canadians that I'm a descendant of couldn't push any further than we pushed.
Yeah.
In fact, some cases it pushed too far and then had to retreat.
Right.
Like there's weird little ghost towns where I'm from Medicine Hat, hey?
Okay.
And I didn't know that on the way to Suffield, which is where the military base is, there are towns that don't exist anymore because they just couldn't be viable out there in the prairie as so-called towns.
Yeah.
Because the kind of culture that the settlers wanted to bring over just wouldn't work here.
Yeah, it's not,
and so I think that's a kind of a neat thing is that the project of turning the entire planet into my human mirror of my asshole culture is finding itself at a point where it's like can't really do that as much as was hoped for, and so there's something bigger than the Anthropocene here that I think if we attend to it, we can feel it. I don't know if we often do attend to it, but like I've driven up to Slave Lake a few times. I'm a Southern boy, right? So
that's where I'm from. I grew up Slave Lake.
Oh, no way. Okay, cool. Yeah. The drive up there's points where there's a bit of a rise in the road and I can see the boreal forest just go on forever.
You're just hitting the edge of the lower foothills.
Yeah.
Right before you hit the lake. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, yeah. And just this unsettling, empty hugeness, which is not actually empty. It's full of just not.
But it's a carpet of trees with lakes.
Yeah. Right. And I'm like, well, so, or once I drove up to northern Saskatchewan because my grandfather settled there after the war, and ran a little co-op store in a town that doesn't exist anymore either.
Right. Yeah.
And it's literally the end of the road. Like you just can't drive anymore.
That's it. Yeah.
And like,
we tried. It didn't work out.
No, right. Yeah. I'm like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And so to feel like nature is, a looming presence of threat to a particular form of culture. And that particular form of culture is the one that tried to colonize everything.
Yeah.
I was like, hey, it didn't, there's more and it's stronger than the world is stronger than that form of culture was.
Right.
It is. And I find hope in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is beautiful to contemplate for sure.
Yeah. Because I did my doctoral work in Belgium, which is the second most densely populated country in Europe after the Netherlands. And it's neat. It's got walkable cities, all these nice things. But the town I lived in, which had 80,000 people in it, would fit inside the Edmonton's municipal airport.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
That's well.
I mean, within the ring road anyway. They've got their little suburbs and whatnot too, right?
Yeah, sure.
But the ring road, so their Anthony Henday would go around the municipal airport. And so, it's densely packed and everything. But then, boy, if that was a thing that we could have surrounded by forest,
right,
I would be up for that.
Right. Yeah.
Right. I imagine it would be very difficult to do that in the part of Belgium that I lived in. I don't know. I mean, the southern part of Belgium is forested. It's the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge was there and stuff, right? So it does kind of feel like Banff without mountains in parts of it. But where the presence of the human is so heavy on the landscape, the Belgians invented the land reclamation that the Dutch used to make Holland.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So there were some monks on the seashore that were like, hey, what if we did this?
Yeah.
But so nature reclamation in the Netherlands and is very different in the sense that they're like, well, we've got this piece of dirt that's under the sea level that we're not using anymore. Why don't we pretend that it's from the Pleistocene? And then we'll try to see what we can do with that. And so you have these fenced enclosures where nature is running around trying to do its thing, and then they have problems with controlling the population of herbivores in there.
Sure.
Or wolves are coming in, and like, we don't want wolves coming in. Whereas here,
it was us imposing our will once again.
Yeah, right. And so the will, Canada is the imposition of a will. Let's not be. I don't want to deny that.
Totally.
But there's more to be pushing back on that will imposition than I think we see in Europe or in the United States, and maybe elsewhere too.
We're fortunate that I think we have more leeway to try things here.
Yeah.
Because we're not. Yeah.
And so I still, it's very complex. I'm not sure, right? I mean, because the indigenous people of this land are here, and the project of the culture that I'm talking about tried to exterminate them.
Yeah.
And failed. And thank God for that, that they failed. But I don't know what the future holds, but it's a place, I don't know where else this opportunity might exist.
Sure. Australia, perhaps.
Maybe. Yeah.
Australia, I know, it's very similar, right? They have a ring around the outside.
Right. And then the interior is like this.
Is all, a lot of it's desert, but there's a lot of bush, right?
Yeah,
and I know, I did a podcast called Good Fire with a woman, Amy Cardinal Christensen, all about Indigenous fire practices,
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And a lot of probably the place where the most cool things are happening and the most activities happening as far as, whereas like Western culture and Indigenous practices are starting to work together in a way where Indigenous people are they're getting autonomy back to do the things that they know how to do that we have no idea.
Yeah.
And so that was I learned that Australia is very similar to Canada in that regard. In that there is same thing, tried to kill off the indigenous people, large part successful, but not completely. And therefore there's a strong relationship comparison there.
Cool. Yeah. So maybe Canada has one, but not the only, but a uniquely strong potential for decolonizing.
Yeah.
And not only politically too, but maybe even in our relationship with nature.
Yeah.
Which I find really inspiring and hopeful. I don't know anything about it.
No.
But I feel like that's a possibility that's amazing.
Yeah. Increased indigenous governance in natural resources and that stuff, I think is only showing positive outcomes, really. Like it's
nice. There's an indigenous philosopher from roughly, I think around Kamloops or Kelowna. Jeanette Armstrong is her name, and I think her people are the Silks, I think. But I can't remember very well. But she gave a really great talk at the U of A couple of years ago, and the thing that I remember the most about it was she wanted settler people like me to be indigenized. And I was like, damn, that's nice.
Yeah.
And that's scary and cool, and I don't know what that's going to mean, but I think that I don't think I could say that, or I think that could be said to me if I was in Belgium.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I mean, and in some sense, the Belgian or the indigenous people of Belgium.
What's the thing? There's everyone's indigenous of somewhere.
Somewhere, right? But I want to be indigenous here.
Right, exactly.
And I think to be that is to give up on the project of colonization and also urbanization in some ways, possibly, in a way that relates me back into the natural world, or just the world, in some sense, the land, really. But yeah, again, know very little about it, but Canada is a bad place in a lot of ways, but an amazingly has such crazy cool potential.
Yeah.
That's really exciting.
So we have an opportunity here to maybe, and that was made very clear with that was my point of bringing this up.
Yeah.
Was that I had never considered Canada or Australia for that matter as a place where there's a unique opportunity here to try something else.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, because we were at the far edge of an attempt to turn it all into the same, which came out of Europe, and then it stopped. Like agriculture just can't go all the places here.
Yeah,
and I think
agriculture
was one of the tools. For colonization.
2-month growing season doesn't really help, but I think
and I'm okay with that.
I think the American listeners might not like this, but the more I read about everybody in the hunting community praises American conservationism in the sense of like there's so much game. Right?
Yeah,
there's so much game. There's more white-tailed deer now than there's ever been. Like what a great thing! And I'm like, that's not okay. Mm-hmm. Like something else was removed. So now so you think about America, like, they've done incredible things. I don't mean to take away from what they've been able to accomplish, but I don't want that here. Right? I don't want more white-tailed deer than there's ever been. Yeah. I want a healthy amount of white-tailed deer. The same way I want a healthy amount of wolves and bears and caribou and chipmunks and people. I want there to be a healthy amount of everything. Yep. And that means that there's going to be less game animals than I would like because I can't just go out into, like you look at, I can't remember what state it is, but the state that has the most elk, right?
Oh,
it's got like, I can't remember. It's like 350,000 elk in one state. I can't remember which one. That's a quarter or a third the size of Alberta. And Alberta has literally a tenth of that.
Wow.
We have 35,000 elk in a space that's 3 times as big. And you're like, well, what's going on?
I mean, is that because it's always been a great elk part of the world, or I
suspect partially yes.
Okay.
It's great elk country, but also because conservation has promoted. There's no wolves. There's very few wolves. There's very few cats. There's very few bears. And that's because people are there and we don't like them, but we like the elk, so we let the elk do their thing, right? Like you can use the Yellowstone example as a thing, right? Where there was tons of elk in Yellowstone. They introduced wolves. And people were pissed for a little while because it decimated the elk population. They weren't seeing elk anymore. But then all of a sudden the landscape changed. And you had this trophic cascade where the landscape became more healthy and not this monoculture of grass or whatever. Right. So, my point is that I don't want American conservationism in Canada. I want Canadian conservationism in Canada.
Good call.
Right? Yeah. Like it's a totally different thing. I think there's lessons to be learned for sure. And there's things we can take that we can enjoy. But let's not try to make all of the forest something that is what we want it to be. Let's also let the forest be a forest.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And the prairie and all the other bits of it too, right?
Yeah.
Like I wasn't aware of this until I went to the Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan, and it sounded like I could be wrong about this, but I got the impression that white-tailed deer basically follow the agricultural tillage of areas.
Yeah, it's a weird.
They move in.
Yes, it's a weird thing. I know. It's all the study of this is it's not very good. I know I've spoken to a lot of people about this, and everybody has different answers. Everybody is different. Okay. So it's but anecdotally, from the anecdotal side, I get the same story from everybody, right?
Yeah.
From people where I grew up in Slave Lake.
Yep.
It's almost, it's in the middle of like the geographical center of Alberta.
Right. It should be the capital city pretty much. Yeah.
For sure. But, I grew up with hunting whitetail all the time.
Okay.
Right. Talk to people who've lived there their whole lives and they were born in the 30s, 40s, 50s. They'll be like, well, there wasn't a white-tailed deer here until the 80s.
No way.
And you're like, oh. And so there was these islands of mule deer. I watched, there was one small community of mule deer outside my home where I grew up right in the boreal. And, it was slowly killed by cars. Just like slowly died out for I haven't seen one there in 20 years now, but there was a small community, probably 20 of them. Right. And I haven't seen one in 20 years. And so I think you're right. Like with people come other animals. Yeah. Right. And it slowly changed the thing, whether or not that's because people came there we killed off all the predators and therefore, or whatever. I don't know what the reasoning is, the causality of it, but, there's more white-tailed deer than there's supposed to be. That's for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I don't hunt whitetail. I hunt muleys down south.
Right.
And there's whitetail down there somewhere, but they're a little bit too wary for me.
Yeah.
But interesting.
But there's something going on there for sure. And Anthropocene, right? We changed things.
Well, it's fun. I just look at a map every once in a while and I see the roads, and I'm like, wow, there's not as many of them. Part of Alberta, part of Canada are like that, sure, but less so. Like it's just not completely, utterly fragmented by fields and roads and towns and whatnot. And that's what I mean by the porosity of it.
Yes.
So even the cities, and I don't like living in a city, man. Right. I don't like it here at all. But this city is got more nature in it than the cities that I've been in elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
Which is amazing and cool. So the fact that there could have been a mountain lion in the river valley or not long ago is like hot damn.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
That's amazing. The cougar are moving back into the Cypress Hills apparently for the last decade or so or longer maybe. Following the creeks into Medicine Hat. I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
Now that doesn't mean that Medicine Hatters are happy about this because, but that's not my concern. Right?
We have to learn to live with nature, not just dominate it.
Yeah. So, I think that is opening ourselves to being porous too.
Yes.
So porosity isn't only something that is in the landscape of Canada, but also something that we can cultivate in ourselves. Which goes back to some of what we were saying earlier, is that we can be mindfully open to there being cougar in our river valley and maybe coyotes eating people's dogs, or whatever it happens to be.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. That brings to mind the idea of porosity in ourselves to nature. It brings to mind of everyone has a lawn here in Canada, right? Yeah. And we can maybe start to plant more, you can plant some raspberry bushes.
Yeah.
You can plant some strawberry. You can plant some more native plants, which will help bring in more insects, which will help bring in more nature. There's little things you can do that can, rather than, going to the garden center and picking up some posies that don't exist here and planting them and then doing it again next year because they don't make it.
Yep.
So we could start to do little things like that make a big difference. And
I try, and I don't know how big of a difference it does make, but I do it anyway, and I I get people coming by my yard going, "What are you trying to do?" But I think that's a way of personally, it's one of the ways I try to respect the ecosystem here.
Yeah.
I try to say, well, what kinds of things do grow here other than Kentucky bluegrass?
Yeah.
And then maybe I can put a lot of that in my yard.
Yeah.
I still have partially lawn.
Yeah.
But then I think I've got some creeping red fescue in my lawn.
Oh, yeah.
But no, I have a little sign now because I had some old ladies from the retirement home not far from they would walk by my house and then ask me if I was growing hay for my cattle or whatever.
Yeah, like what's going on?
So I have a little sign now. So these are the native plants that I've tried to plant in my front yard.
Yeah.
And so it's and that might be just one small thing that is helpful in some way that I maybe will ever find out about. But
yeah. Oh, I think so. I'm on this journey right now where I just bought a new house 2 years ago, and I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with the yards, right? Yeah. And I think it'd be sweet to have just plant some like thimbleberry and some raspberry and some blueberry and some a bunch of different kind of crop plants that are native, right? And just do that in my front yard, and you'll have like the kids coming by and scooping some blueberries.
Oh, sure.
And perfect. You're creating like a community thing, whatever.
Oh yeah.
And so, but it goes against the aesthetic that we've decided of our lawn culture, right?
Yeah.
It's not,
that's part of the culture that was brought over by the settlers was it needs to look like a manner, I guess, of an English.
Manicured, right. Yeah. Keep it tidy,
right. So back to my very first encounter with environmental philosophy, environmental aesthetics actually carries with it the impacts that are morally relevant too. Just because what we want things to look like will actually determine in some ways how we relate to ecosystems and animals,
absolutely,
and indigenous people and all sorts of other things.
Yeah. Something that came to mind that I meant to bring up earlier was talking about that, like how we think about things, how we contemplate things, right? I remember listening to something where they were talking about the difference in languages and how that changes. It was about financial stuff, right? So they were talking about, I can't remember, maybe it was Korean, I can't remember, but they're like, in one of these Asian languages, there is no past, future.
Oh yeah.
Current, like present discussion. Everything is neutral.
Mm-hmm.
So they found that in some of these Asian cultures, there's like really, really good saving. Like everyone is like, they're very good at saving their money because like their concept of their life, the future and the now are twined.
Okay.
Whereas for us, we very clearly define it as now, then, and later.
Yeah.
And so we're like, well, I'll worry about it later. And so they were talking about the fact that like in the Western culture, we're terrible at saving. We have a real hard time doing it relative to other cultures, like some Asian cultures that they seem to be inherently really good at it just because of the nature of the way their brain works because of the language that they have.
Huh.
And so I think that paints a good picture of how we think about things can change the way we act in reality.
Yes.
Right. Which is why it comes back to philosophy and these have tangible effects, if you follow it through.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, languages structure our world for ourselves. And it's weird because we don't think of that because we're using the language when we're thinking. But we don't realize how the language structures how we think too. Yeah. And so there can be even things where we wish we didn't have them in our language.
Yeah, totally.
Sometimes you're like, oh, right.
Yeah.
Like to cultivate the mind is one of the phrases we use sometimes, and that's supposed to be a good thing. But then cultivation, I was like, wait a minute, why is that a good thing to just tear out what was there previously and, strip the soil into lines and then put in some seeds that are probably not native. Yeah. And that's a weird metaphor for becoming an intellectual.
That is true.
Yeah. So little things like that too, I just noticed about English. But anyway, there's the way that, thought and linguistic structure and culture shape our world in ways we didn't know it was doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's important to think about things differently. Challenge yourself, like you said before, right? Be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Ask yourself why you're uncomfortable. Come to that. Yeah.
So now I'm uncomfortable because I'm wondering about half of the things that I've said, if I've said horrible things and I've said things that I would regret or that I didn't mean to say and they will be heard the wrong way.
Yeah.
I apologize in advance for all the really terrible things that probably came out of my mouth that I haven't really realized I said yet.
What I should be doing at the beginning of every podcast is saying that I did for a little while and then I forgot about it, was this is not indicative of anyone's ideas. This is just two people having a conversation, exploring some ideas, and thinking about where this might go. It doesn't mean you should take this at face value.
Fair enough. And then other people are going to listen to this and hopefully not crucify me.
Yeah. I think you're good. I think you covered it.
That helps a little. We had to pat ourselves on the back a second time.
Well, that's how you got to finish.
Okay.
Otherwise it's on a negative note. You got to finish by saying, but it's okay, everybody. You can go back to eating your cereal, which came from wherever. And it's all good. Let's go jump in our car and go get some Starbucks.
Correct. Phew.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks very much.
Hey, my pleasure.
That'll twist your mind a little bit, hey? Just kind of, it's fun though. Isn't it fun? It feels good. I don't know. It's like, it makes you think, feel like different neurons are firing when you're thinking philosophically. It's awesome. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Nathan, for taking the time to come on. This was so great. Can't wait to do it again. And, if you like this conversation, please rate and review it, share it on social media, tell your friends, tell your family, get it out there. The more people that hear these episodes, the easier it is for me to keep making them. So thank you. Take care. We'll catch you next time.